everyone, it's Miss Stewart. Welcome to your notes on 1.3, which is aquatic biomes. The learning objective for this is going to be describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of aquatic biomes. What you're going to learn during these notes is about freshwater biomes, marine biomes, which marine means there's saltwater, and then we're also going to look at some of the global distribution of non-mineral marine natural resources. And the skill that you're going to have by the end of this is to be able to explain environmental concepts and processes. So we're going to look at the characteristics of aquatic biomes. Now, the first one is going to be salinity, which is how much salt there is in the water. And this is going to be important because it determines what species can survive, because species need adaptations to deal with all that salt, but also if we can use it for drinking. So a freshwater versus an estuary versus an ocean. Another characteristic is going to be the depth. And the reason this is important is because it influences the amount of sunlight that can get in and reach the plants. Plants need sunlight in order to do photosynthesis. So if it's too deep and there is not sunlight able to get through, then that is going to mean that plants are not able to do photosynthesis at those depths. Additionally, the flow, which is going to determine which plants and organisms can survive, versus also how much oxygen can be dissolved into the water. We also have a major characteristic of temperature, because warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen. So that means that there can't be as many organisms in it, because remember that even aquatic organisms breathe in oxygen. And so they are going to need that dissolved oxygen in order to survive and do cellular respiration. Now we're first going to look at the freshwater. Now freshwater means there is no salt in it. And these are going to be rivers and lakes. Now rivers have a high amount of oxygen because of the flow of the mixing water in the air. So when it's all mixing together, you're getting little bubbles of air that are getting mixed in and getting dissolved into the water. And these also carry nutrient-rich sediment, which means the soil is going to be really fertile. There's going to be a lot of nutrients in it. Now we have lakes, which are going to be standing bodies of fresh water. Now lakes are going to be where we get our drinking water from. So they are very important when it comes to drinkability for water. Now there's different areas of the lakes, which you can see in the diagram over here. Now we have the littoral, which is going to be shallow water with emergent plants. And emergent plants just means they are emerging up out of the water. So think like cattails, where they've got the roots in the water, but their stalk goes up. Then we also have the limnetic, where light can reach. So photosynthesis can happen. We don't have rooted plants at this point because they can't get up out of the water. We just have phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are basically plankton that do photosynthesis. So they're kind of closely like plants. They aren't technically plants, but they're sort of like it. And then we have the profundal. Now this is going to be too deep for sunlight. Photosynthesis can't occur here, so you don't have any organisms doing photosynthesis. And then the bottom is the benthic. This is basically the really murky bottom where invertebrates such as bugs are going to live. And there's nutrient-rich sediment because you have all of the dead organisms that have fallen to the bottom, and then they're making up the soil on the bottom. So it's really nutrient-rich down there. Now, another type of freshwater that we have are wetlands. And wetlands are going to be areas where the soil is submerged in water for at least part of the year. But it's still shallow enough that you have those emergent plants that can come up. And since you have a lot of these emergent plants, it's going to be a pretty productive biome. Now, remember that the plants here have to be adapted to living with the roots submerged. And this is why it's got a star, because this is where we start to make connections between adaptations versus these biomes. And so this is going to be, for example, you'll have cattails, lily pads, reeds. In order to survive here, they have to be adapted to have their roots in the water that much. Now, wetlands do have a lot of benefits to them. They can store excess water during storms, which means they lessen floods. It also recharges groundwater by absorbing rainfall into the soil. So you have groundwater deep down, and this is going to take the rainfall, it's going to slowly get it into the soil so that you get more of that groundwater underneath at lower levels. Additionally, the roots from the wetland plants filter pollutants from water draining through. So wetlands are really important when it comes to filtering out any sort of toxins that might be in water. So if you think about like stormwater runoff and stuff coming off of the roads with oil, wetlands are going to be super important for filtering those pollutants before the water goes through to the groundwater. And there also, you have a lot of plant growth due to lots of water and nutrients from the decaying organic matter that gets into the soil. And so there's a lot of plants. It's a very productive area. And this is going to be a few different examples of types of wetlands. So you can sort of see how you have different adaptations. Now, in a swamp, you might look at the cypress tree, how this tree sticks up and out, but it's got these roots that are able to be submerged in the water. And we also have a marsh. You're going to see some examples of the lilies and the grass there. And they also are emergent plants. And these are different types of plants, but they have the adaptation that they can have their roots under submerged and then they emerge up. And then the last type of example would be a bog. And this is where you're going to get some of this moss. You have some spruce trees that also are able to be somewhat submerged. And so these are just 3 different types of specific, they're all under the wetland umbrella, but they have some similar adaptations, but you see these different types of plant species with the same adaptation where they can be submerged with their roots. Now we have estuaries. Estuaries are kind of the in-between between freshwater and saltwater because it's where rivers empty into the ocean. So you get the mix here where you have the fresh and the saltwater. Now species have to be adapted to freshwater and saltwater, which is not as easy as it sounds. So an example of this would be a mangrove tree. They are able to do freshwater and saltwater. Now, estuaries are also highly productive. There's a lot of plant growth because, again, this is another area where we're getting nutrients in the sediments deposited. So the rivers are bringing down all these sediments, the leaves, the dead organisms, and it's coming into the soil at the end of this river where it meets the ocean. And we have a few different types of estuaries. So we've got a salt marsh, and this is going to be along the coast in temperate climates. It's a breeding ground for a lot of fish and shellfish species, so it's really important for a lot of these organisms. They live out in the ocean and then they come up, they lay their eggs here, and then they go off because this is kind of a protected, productive area where a lot of their offspring can survive. And this is going to be an example of what a salt marsh looks like. Now, the second type that we have is the mangroves, which mangrove swamps are basically an area with a lot of mangrove trees. And this is an estuary habitat, usually along tropical climates. So you can see some of these in areas like Florida. And you have these mangrove trees with long stilted roots, like you can see right here. And they can deal with the tide coming in and out. So this looks like it's at lower tide where the roots are more exposed. At high tide, the roots won't be as exposed. But they have these long stilt roots, and they're really beneficial because they stabilize the shoreline. And then they also provide habitat for a lot of fish and shellfish in here. If you were to go into a mangrove forest, you would see a ton of little fish and invertebrates all around because these roots kind of provide protected environments. This is another area where organisms will come and have their babies here or lay their eggs and then leave because this is a really good area for young organisms to survive. In addition to adult organisms live here too. Now, one of the other types of aquatic biomes, we are now moving into the totally saltwater, so completely marine here. And coral reefs are going to be the most biodiverse marine biome on Earth. And this is going to be in areas where you have warm, shallow water, but it's going to be a little bit past the shoreline. Now, a coral reef, if you are not familiar with coral and how it's made, coral as I briefly mentioned in the notes of 1.1, are an example of a mutualistic relationship. You have the coral, which is an animal, and then you have algae, which is a plant. Coral takes carbon dioxide out of the ocean, and it creates calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So the actual like hard coral things that you're used to seeing, that's going to be the exoskeleton that's made of calcium carbonate. And then it also provides carbon dioxide to the algae through breathing out from cellular respiration. Now, algae live in this coral, and they provide sugar to the coral through photosynthesis. So algae are like plants, so they do photosynthesis, they create sugar, and the coral animal can use that sugar for food to have energy. Now, both species rely on the other one. This is why it's a mutualistic relationship. If you remember, mutualistic relationships, they're a type of symbiotic one, and they both have that plus, which means they both benefit. Coral actually could not survive without the algae. And then the algae need the CO2 from the coral. So they both benefit and they both need each other. And they create this really biodiverse ecosystem, essentially, where you have a ton of different types of fish and organisms that live in these reefs. Now, we also have the intertidal zone, which here in the Pacific Northwest, we've got a lot of these here. So if you ever go down to the Puget Sound and you see, or you're out like on the coast, you're going to see intertidal zones on the coast of Washington, Oregon, this area. And this is going to be a narrow band of coastline between high and low tide. Sorry, let me stay on this for a second. So if you look at this, you've got kind of the rocks going down, you've got the low tide down here, and then the water will come up to high tide. And so this rocky area is going to experience both low tide and high tide. Now, organisms need to be adapted to survive these crashing waves, the heat from direct sunlight during low tide. So they have to be specifically adapted to this type of kind of harsh environment. So this will be things like barnacles, sea stars, and crabs that can attach themselves to rocks are going to be organisms that are adapted to this. A lot of times they're going to have shells and tough outer skin so that they don't dry out during the low tide. So they can hold on with the crashing, and they can also not dry out during the heat. And different organisms are going to be adapted to living in the different zones. So if you look at kind of this low zone versus this high zone, they're going to be slightly different when it comes to some of their adaptations. So an example of this would be a spiral whack, which is a type of seaweed. And they have the ability to curl up and secrete a mucus to retain water during low tide. So keep in mind that, remember, again, kind of a theme of the organisms in these different areas is they have to have specific adaptations to live in these specific different biomes. Now, the last one is going to be the open ocean. This is an area that does not have productivity. It is a low productivity area because there are not much plants. You only have kind of some algae, and then phytoplankton can survive in most of the ocean. You're not going to see any sort of emerging. There's nothing for them to get all the way up. So it's just algae and phytoplankton. However, even though it's not very productive, it is so large. I mean, think about a map of the ocean and how much of it you see. It is so large that the algae and the phytoplankton of the ocean actually produce majority of Earth's oxygen and absorb majority of Earth's atmospheric carbon dioxide. So even though it's not very productive, especially compared to a wetland or an estuary, it does have just so much amount of it that cumulatively it actually produces the most oxygen. You're having the most amount of photosynthesis kind of happening cumulatively. Now, there are different parts of the open ocean. You've got the photic zone, which is an area where sunlight can reach. Photosynthesis can happen in this area. This is where you have your algae and your phytoplankton. Then you have the aphotic zone, which is also called the abyssal. And this area is going to be too deep for sunlight. You're not going to have any algae or phytoplankton down here because sunlight can't reach down there. And this is where you might recognize some of these animals that oftentimes look a little bit weird or creepy, but these animals are going to be adapted to being down without sunlight, with the crushing pressure of all that water coming down on them. So what you're going to have now is your practice FRQ for 1.3. The skill is to explain an environmental concept and processes, so you're working on that concept explanation. And what I want you to do for this FRQ practice is to identify an organism found in an aquatic biome and explain how that organism is uniquely adapted to live in that biome. Well, those are your 1.3 notes. This was Miss Stewart, and I hope this was helpful.